The night shift at St. Mary's Hospital was supposed to be quiet, the kind of quiet that makes the hum of fluorescent lights sound deafening. Nurse Danielle Harris adjusted her badge, exhaustion written across her face. It had been another 12-hour marathon, tending to patients, holding hands of strangers, and documenting yet another case of police brutality that arrived through the ER doors. But tonight, something felt off. As she stepped out to the parking lot, her car keys slipped from her trembling hands. Red and blue lights suddenly bathed the pavement in chaos. 4 police cruisers blocked her path, engines growling. Officers stepped out, hands on their holsters, shouting orders she didn't understand. "Hands where we can see them, don't move!" Danielle froze. Her heart pounded so hard it drowned out their voices. She tried to speak, to explain she worked here, that she'd just finished her shift, but one of the officers shoved her against her own car, cuffing her wrists with cold steel. Inside the hospital, nurses and patients watched through the glass doors, confused, whispering. The same woman who had saved lives for years was now being treated like a criminal. "Ma'am, we got a call. They said you were tampering with patient records." Danielle's eyes lifted, meeting the officer's glare. Her voice was calm, steady, and dangerous. "I know exactly who made that call," she said. "And I told the FBI this would happen." The officer blinked, uncertain. Around them, the radios crackled with static. No one there knew that the woman they were handcuffing wasn't just another nurse. She was the secret witness behind a federal investigation, the one gathering evidence against a ring of officers, accused of covering up abuse and falsifying medical reports. And tonight, they had just made their biggest mistake. Before we dive into this story, I have a special request for you. I'd love to know, from what country and city are you watching this video? It's truly amazing how stories like this one travel across the world, touching hearts and opening eyes everywhere. So take a second, drop your location in the comments, and let's see how far this message can go. The night shift incident. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital flickered against the midnight sky, humming like a warning. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion. Nurse Danielle Harris signed off the last patient chart, rubbed her eyes and whispered goodnight to the skeleton crew still working the floor. Her shift had been brutal. 2 overdoses, 1 shooting victim, and a mother who didn't make it through childbirth. But for Danielle, this was more than a job. It was her calling. She pushed through the sliding doors into the cold night air, pulling her cardigan tight around her scrubs. Her car sat alone under the yellow glow of a flickering street lamp. The hospital parking lot was quiet, eerily so. She clicked her keys, and the sharp chirp of the alarm echoed across the asphalt. Then came the blinding flash of headlights. 3 squad cars rolled in, fast, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Tires screeched, doors slammed, shouts filled the air. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle, hands where we can see them." Danielle froze, confusion flooding her veins. She turned slowly, raising her hands, the hospital ID badge glinting under the lights. "I work here," she tried to say, her voice trembling but steady. "I'm a nurse. This is my car." But her words were drowned by commands barked through radios and adrenaline. One officer, his hand gripping his gun, circled around her. Another snatched her keys from the ground. "Got a call about suspicious activity in the parking lot," he said. "Someone matching your description." Matching her description. A black woman, late 30s, scrubs, tired. That was enough. Danielle's pulse quickened. She'd been through enough to know what was happening, but not why. When the cold metal of handcuffs snapped around her wrists, the sound cut through the night like thunder. She looked at the officer. Disbelief and something deeper. Disappointment filling her eyes. "Officer," she said softly, "you're making a mistake." He ignored her, reciting rote lines about procedure and protocol. Behind the glass doors of the ER, a few nurses gathered, watching in shock. They didn't move. No one did. Danielle didn't resist. She couldn't. She knew too well what resistance could cost. But as they pushed her into the back of the squad car, her gaze caught the hospital's reflection in the window. The place where she had spent years saving lives was now the scene of her own arrest. And somewhere deep inside, she already knew. This wasn't about a call. It was about silence. The kind she had refused to keep. Who is Danielle Harris? Danielle Harris was the kind of woman who could bring warmth into the coldest corners of a hospital. A 38-year-old black nurse with her hair neatly tied in a bun and eyes that carried both fatigue and fierce compassion. She was the heartbeat of the night shift, the kind of nurse who remembered every patient's name, who stayed 5 extra minutes to adjust a pillow, who could sense pain before anyone spoke. She had worked at Dallas General Hospital for more than a decade. During the pandemic, she was among the first to volunteer for high-risk wards. Her colleagues often said she had the angel's touch, a compliment that always made her smile shyly before she got back to work. But beneath the calm and the kindness, Danielle carried invisible scars. She had seen too many last breaths, held too many trembling hands, and still somehow managed to show up every night, putting on that white uniform like armor. For Danielle, nursing wasn't just a job, it was a calling. On weekends, she mentored young black students who dreamed of careers in healthcare. She knew what it meant to face suspicious eyes, to feel underestimated, to work twice as hard to be seen as equal. What she didn't know was that one night, everything she stood for, her integrity, her compassion, her years of service, would be turned against her. That night, Danielle had just finished a brutal 12-hour shift. It was almost 2 in the morning when she stepped out the side door of the hospital, holding a cup of cold coffee, her ID badge hanging loosely from her pocket. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a dark car parked under a flickering light in the distance. She noticed it, hesitated for a second, then kept walking. Just another night, she thought. Her mind drifted, thinking about the patient she'd stabilized, about her daughter asleep at home, about the rare Sunday off she'd been promised. Everything felt routine, until flashing blue lights cut through the darkness behind her. 2 police officers stepped out, shouting commands she barely understood. Danielle froze, raising her hands, confusion flooding her voice. "I'm a nurse, I work here," she pleaded, but her words were swallowed by the metallic click of handcuffs. The woman who had spent years saving lives was suddenly treated like a suspect, and in that instant, Danielle realized a painful truth. Sometimes, even a white uniform can't protect you. Her past and calling. Long before the flashing lights, before the fear and confusion in that parking lot, there was a little girl named Danielle who dreamed of helping people, the kind of dream that grows quietly in the heart of a child who's seen both pain and courage up close. She grew up in the small town of Shreveport, Louisiana, in a modest 2-bedroom house with peeling paint and a front porch that creaked under her father's boots. Her mother, Gloria, was a nurse at the local clinic, the kind of woman who could heal with a smile and a warm touch. Her father, Sergeant Harris, was a stern but loving army man who believed in discipline, faith, and doing what's right, even when no one's watching. Their house was small, but it was filled with love and rules. Danielle learned early that life wasn't always fair, especially for a black family in the Deep South. Her father would tell her, "Baby, the world might not see you the way you see yourself, but that's why you gotta shine brighter." Those words became her compass. When she was 8, Danielle watched her mother tend to a neighbor who'd collapsed on their porch. No panic, no hesitation, just calm hands, soft words, and steady breaths until help arrived. That moment burned into Danielle's memory like a photograph. That was the night she decided, "I want to be like her." Her teenage years were a balancing act, school during the day, helping her mum on night shifts, and church choir on Sundays. She wasn't the loudest or the boldest, but she carried an inner light that drew people to her. Teachers saw her potential, even when resources were scarce. Her mother would say, "You've got healing in your hands, baby. Don't waste it." When Danielle finally earned her nursing degree, it was more than a diploma. It was a victory for her entire family. Her father cried that day, the proud kind of tears he'd spent a lifetime holding back. She went on to work in hospitals across Texas, slowly building a reputation as the one nurse everyone could count on, calm under pressure, sharp, and deeply human. For Danielle, every patient was a story, every shift a chance to honor her mother's legacy and her father's discipline. She never sought fame or recognition, only purpose. And that purpose, that calling she'd nurtured since childhood, was what made the events of that night so cruel. Because for someone who dedicated her entire life to saving others, being treated like a criminal was more than injustice. It was betrayal. The system within the system. It started as a whisper, the kind of unease you can't quite name, but can't ignore either. Danielle had been working as an ER nurse for almost a decade by then, long enough to see patterns the untrained eye would miss. It was always late at night when the stories came in, young men with bruised ribs and split lips, women trembling in silence, teenagers who flinched at every sudden movement, and more often than not, a police report that didn't match the wounds. At first, Danielle tried to brush it off. Hospitals were chaotic places, stories got mixed, emotions ran high. But the pattern was too consistent. The same neighborhoods, The same officer's name scribbled on intake forms, the same look in her patient's eyes, a mixture of pain, fear, and defeat. She'd overhear them whispering while the doctors were gone. They said I resisted. They laughed when I asked for help. They told me not to say anything. Danielle would hold their hands, patch them up, and tell them softly, "You're safe now." But inside she wasn't sure that was true. The breaking point came one night when a boy, barely 16, was wheeled in with a shattered jaw. The officers standing nearby called it self-inflicted. Danielle knew better. She saw the handprints on his face, the bruises shaped like boots. And when the boy's mother arrived sobbing, one of the officers smirked and said, "Ma'am, you should teach your kid some respect." That smirk stayed with her. It haunted her during every shift. That was the night Danielle realized she wasn't just part of a hospital. She was inside a system that often protected the wrong people. She began writing notes, quietly, discreetly, patient IDs, times, badge numbers, anything that didn't violate her oath but told the truth. She never shared them with anyone, not even her closest friends. It wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. And the more she wrote, the heavier the notebook became, not in weight, but in consequence. Because deep down, Danielle knew that one day someone would notice, and when they did, they wouldn't see a nurse doing her duty. They'd see a black woman daring to question authority. Still, she couldn't stop. Silence, she once told a new nurse, is a disease too. Danielle Harris had sworn to heal people. Now she was trying to heal the truth, one wound at a time. The first report. The night she decided to speak up wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost painfully ordinary. Danielle had just finished stitching a man's forehead when she overheard two officers laughing near the vending machine. Their words cut through the hum of hospital machines like glass. "Guy swung at us first," one said, shaking his head. "Guess he won't be doing that again." Danielle froze. The man they were talking about was lying 2 rooms down, unconscious, ribs fractured, one lung partially collapsed. His swing couldn't have done much against 2 armed men. She looked at her clipboard, at the bruising pattern on the patient's abdomen, and felt something inside her snap, not with rage, but with conviction. That night, after her shift, she stayed behind. The hospital's fluorescent lights flickered overhead as she typed her first official report. It wasn't emotional or accusatory. It was clinical, factual. A nurse documenting inconsistencies between police statements and medical evidence. She added photographs, timestamps, and her own observations. She followed protocol perfectly. When she hit submit, her heart raced. Not from fear, but from hope, the naive kind that believes truth still matters. Days passed, then a week. Nothing. When she finally followed up, the hospital administrator, Mr. Grayson, gave her a tight smile. "Danielle," he said, "you're one of our best. But these kinds of complaints, they can complicate things. The city contracts with the department. You understand." She didn't. Or maybe she did, and that's what hurt the most. He patted her shoulder as if to calm her. "Just focus on the patients. Let the authorities handle the authorities." That night, she sat in her car long after her shift ended, the glow of the dashboard painting her face in cold blue. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. For the first time, she realized how deep the silence ran, not just in the streets, but in the institutions meant to protect the vulnerable. She thought of her mother, who used to say, "The truth doesn't always roar, baby. Sometimes it whispers until someone's brave enough to speak louder." Danielle whispered that truth into a system that pretended not to hear, but the silence didn't break her. It steeled her. She started making copies of everything, every report, every file, every photo. She didn't know it yet, but this small act of defiance would change the course of her life. Because while her first report was buried under red tape and denial, someone somewhere had read it, and that someone wasn't from the local police. The pattern of silence. After her first report was ignored, Danielle realized something she hadn't fully understood before. The silence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Week after week, the stories kept coming. Patients arrived bruised, beaten, gasping for air. Officers filed their reports with the precision of routine, but their words never matched the reality Danielle saw with her own eyes. Sometimes it was subtle. A nurse told her to mind her own business. A doctor hesitated to note the injuries in a patient's chart, citing hospital politics. Other times it was blatant. One officer laughed in her face when she asked for clarification about a report. Another whispered that she shouldn't poke around where it doesn't concern her. Danielle began to notice a pattern. The more she spoke up, the more doors closed. Files vanished, statements were altered, her colleagues avoided her gaze in the cafeteria. She realized that the institution itself, the hospital, the police, the city officials, had its own way of enforcing silence. She would chart meticulously, capturing dates, times, badge numbers, and discrepancies between injuries and police accounts. But each report was met with the same indifferent nod or polite dismissal. The fear was contagious. Younger nurses whispered about avoiding the problem cases entirely. Doctors who had once encouraged Danielle now hesitated to involve themselves. Administrators spoke in euphemisms. "Let's not complicate relationships," they'd say, or "we must protect the institution." Danielle understood. The system had learned how to survive by teaching everyone to look away. And in that survival, human lives were being broken, unnoticed. She started documenting everything outside the hospital's network. Notes, photographs, even audio snippets where possible. It became a quiet rebellion, a lifeline for the victims whose voices had been stolen. She knew the risks. Being a black nurse challenging authority was dangerous, but watching suffering go unchallenged was worse. Even her personal life began to feel the weight. She started driving a different route home, wary of anyone paying too much attention. The fear was always there, faint but sharp, reminding her that courage had a price. Yet despite the isolation, the fear, and the threats, Danielle remained steadfast. She wasn't just a nurse administering care, she had become a witness, a recorder of truths that others wanted buried. The pattern of silence stretched like a shadow across the hospital and the city, but Danielle's quiet determination was a spark. Fragile, yes, but enough to ignite change. She often thought of her patients, the ones too weak to speak, too scared to fight. They depended on her, and in her mind there was no silence, no system, no fear that could stop her from giving them a voice. The breaking point. It was a Tuesday night, but Danielle would remember it like it was yesterday. The ER doors swung open, and paramedics wheeled in a young black man, barely 20, his body limp, his breathing shallow. Blood stained his shirt, and a deep bruise marked the side of his face. Danielle's heart sank before she even touched him. "Code Red, Trauma 1, she shouted, racing alongside the stretcher. As she began her assessments, she noticed the details didn't add up. The boy's injuries told a story of excessive force, but the accompanying police report claimed a resistant arrest. Danielle's stomach churned. She had seen the euphemisms before. The language meant to absolve wrongdoing, but this time, she knew it was deadly. She moved from nurse to nurse, confirming the pattern: bruises in impossible locations, abrasions inconsistent with the story officers told, small but critical details omitted. Her hands shook as she typed her observations into the system, knowing that this report could be buried like the others. By the time the doctors arrived, it was clear. The boy wasn't going to make it. Danielle held his hand, whispering, "You're safe now. I'm here." Words that felt cruelly hollow in the face of imminent death. Hours later, as the hospital quieted down, she reviewed the paperwork again. Something caught her eye. The official report had been altered. Handwriting not matching the original. Times changed. Phrases smoothed over. It wasn't an accident. Someone had falsified records to protect the officers. Danielle slammed her laptop shut, anger coiling inside her like fire. She felt a familiar weight in her chest. The weight of a system designed to erase truth, to silence witnesses, to let injustice thrive. She remembered the first report she had filed months ago, dismissed by administration. Every ignored word, every sideways glance, every polite "we'll handle it" had led to this moment. A life lost, and all the lies carefully constructed around it. Tears threatened, but Danielle swallowed them. She couldn't allow emotion to cloud action. She couldn't afford to be silenced any longer, not when young lives were at stake. That night she stayed past her shift, copying records, taking photos, making meticulous notes of every discrepancy. She reached out discreetly to contacts she trusted, documenting the falsified reports in a secure external file. Every action was deliberate, calculated, cautious. Danielle understood the stakes. She was a black woman, standing against a network of power, secrecy, and privilege, and yet she felt clarity, a sense of purpose stronger than fear. The breaking point had arrived. No longer could she ignore what she saw. No longer could she pretend the pattern of abuse was anything but systemic. This was bigger than paperwork, bigger than policy, bigger than her career. It was life and death, and Danielle Harris had finally decided she would be the voice for those silenced, no matter the cost. The decision to act. Danielle sat in her small apartment. the hum of the refrigerator the only sound accompanying her racing thoughts. The night outside was quiet, deceptively calm, but inside, her mind was anything but. She stared at the pile of documents on the kitchen table, medical reports, patient charts, altered police files, each one a silent testament to the abuse she had witnessed. For weeks, she had debated her next move. Reporting internally had failed. Administrators had looked the other way. Colleagues had avoided her gaze, and worse, the system had already claimed another life. Each ignored plea felt like a betrayal, a thread unraveling in the fabric of justice she believed in. She knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. Not for the boy who died, not for every patient whose voice had been stolen, not for herself. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She drafted an encrypted email to the FBI, concise, factual, and devoid of emotion, though her hands shook with anticipation. She attached the first batch of evidence, photographs, notes, patient histories, timestamps, and even copies of falsified police reports. She hesitated. The FBI was a federal agency, distant, intimidating, but untouchable by the local networks that had kept her reports buried. They were her last hope. She reminded herself that she had trained her whole life to follow protocol, to care for others, and now she had to trust the system outside her immediate reach. Finally, she hit send. Immediately, a sense of release mixed with dread. Danielle knew that the moment her message was received, a chain reaction would begin. Some people would be grateful, others would be furious. Her own life could be scrutinized, but for the first time in months, she felt a measure of control. She was no longer just a witness. She had become a participant in the fight for justice. Over the next few days, she checked her inbox obsessively. A response came, curt, professional, but promising. The FBI agent on the other end acknowledged receipt and assured her that someone would contact her discreetly to review the evidence. Danielle exhaled, leaning back in her chair. The weight of silence, the constant tension, the fear of institutional retaliation, it all seemed slightly less heavy now. There was a path forward, a chance to break the pattern, to turn her documentation into real action. But she knew the road ahead would not be easy. The local department could retaliate, gossip could spread, careers could be threatened. And yet, Danielle's resolve had solidified. She had watched too many lives ruined by silence to ever go back. That night she went to bed later than usual, her mind racing, her purpose clear. She had acted, she had spoken, and the world, somewhere beyond the walls of the hospital and the confines of her apartment, was beginning to listen. Danielle Harris had stepped into the storm, fully aware of the risks, and for the first time she felt the power of her own courage, a courage that would not be silenced. Double life by day, Danielle Harris was the same devoted nurse everyone had come to rely on. Her scrubs were always crisp, her ID badge gleaming, and her presence a calm anchor for patients and colleagues alike. She moved through the halls of Dallas General with practiced grace, checking vital signs, comforting frightened families, and offering that quiet reassurance that had earned her a reputation as one of the best. Yet by night, Danielle became someone entirely different. Her apartment transformed into a quiet command center, piles of patient files, color-coded folders, encrypted drives, and notes carefully cross-referenced with police reports. She became an observer, a chronicler, a secret witness to the abuses that occurred under the cover of authority. The duality of her life weighed on her, but Danielle had no choice. During the day, she could not reveal her secret mission without jeopardizing her career and her safety. The walls of the hospital were lined with whispers and veiled threats. A single misstep could turn allies into adversaries. So she compartmentalized. In the fluorescent-lit halls, she was the reassuring presence, the nurse who never lost her temper, who answered every call with empathy. At home, under the dim glow of her desk lamp, she transformed into an informant, submitting encrypted updates to her contact at the FBI, documenting discrepancies, noting patterns, and cross-referencing every suspicious incident. It was exhausting. Some nights she fell asleep at her desk, pen in hand, dreams invaded by images of injured patients and indifferent officers. Yet, in that exhaustion, there was purpose, a clarity she had never experienced in the routine of her day job. Her colleagues remained unaware of the life she led after hours. They saw her laugh, watched her comfort a grieving mother, and admired her dedication, never suspecting the clandestine work that occupied her evenings. Danielle understood this was a protective necessity. Exposure could have catastrophic consequences, not just for her, but for the patients whose stories she risked revealing. Even her personal life became a balancing act. Calls from her parents were brief. Friends noticed her occasional absences. She gave vague excuses: overtime, night shifts, extra assignments, and no one questioned her. She couldn't risk anyone knowing the truth. But in the solitude of her apartment, Danielle felt a different kind of connection. To justice, to the victims, to the truth itself. She was no longer just a nurse responding to emergencies. She was a witness to systemic failure, a participant in a quiet battle that demanded patience, courage, and secrecy. Day and night, life and work, care and vigilance, Danielle Harris had learned to live in two worlds. Each step was measured, each choice deliberate, and each report she sent to the FBI was a silent act of defiance. The stakes had never been higher, and she had never felt more alive. Gathering evidence. Danielle knew that proof was everything. Words alone, no matter how precise or heartfelt, would never be enough against a system determined to protect its own. Every night, she transformed her modest apartment into a quiet operations center, a hub of vigilance and strategy. She began methodically documenting everything she could: patient files, incident reports, altered police statements. She copied, scanned, and photographed with meticulous care. Every discrepancy, no matter how minor, was catalogued. Dates, times, badge numbers, and locations were recorded with painstaking precision. Each file was encrypted and backed up on multiple secure drives, hidden beneath layers of digital protection. But documentation alone wouldn't suffice. Danielle needed proof of manipulation, of falsification, of intentional cover-ups. She started carrying a small, discreet audio recorder in her pocket. In the ER, where conversations often drifted between staff and officers, she captured snippets of casual remarks, offhand comments, and subtle admissions that hinted at a deeper pattern of negligence and misconduct. It wasn't easy. She had to remain calm, professional, and above suspicion at all times. One wrong look, one misstep, and her entire operation could be exposed. Yet the stakes, the lives of the vulnerable, the truth buried beneath lies, made every risk worth taking. She also began observing patterns in the reports. Some officers consistently wrote the same vague phrases, like "patient resisted," regardless of the medical evidence. Others altered timestamps or removed references to injuries that didn't align with their story. Danielle photographed these documents, highlighting discrepancies, and cross-referenced them with hospital notes to build a detailed timeline of abuse. Even minor details mattered. She captured images of forms with handwriting that clearly didn't match official signatures, photos of bruises inconsistent with reported incidents, and screenshots of hospital entries that had been mysteriously altered or deleted. Every piece of evidence she collected became another thread in a web of accountability, a web that, when woven together, could no longer be ignored. Danielle understood that the FBI would need more than anecdotal accounts. They needed facts, incontrovertible proof that demonstrated the depth and scope of the misconduct. By day, she was the exemplary nurse, attending to patients, answering calls, and offering comfort. By night, she became a meticulous archivist of injustice, an invisible force recording the truth before it could be erased. Her dedication came at a personal cost. Sleep was scarce, anxiety constant, and every step forward required extraordinary caution. Yet Danielle Harris pressed on, motivated by a singular conviction that truth, carefully documented and courageously presented, could not be silenced. And with each photograph, each recording, and each meticulous note, Danielle was building the case that would eventually change everything, for the victims, for the system, and for herself. The first lead weeks of meticulous work began to bear fruit. Danielle's encrypted files, carefully organized and detailed, had finally reached the hands of someone who could act. The FBI agent she had contacted reviewed the documents with precision, connecting dots that the local system had deliberately ignored. Every altered report, every inconsistency, every whispered admission now formed a clear pattern, a network of abuse, obfuscation, and systemic failure. It started small, a discreet phone call. "Agent Rivera," the voice on the line said, calm but authoritative, "we've started reviewing your files. Can you provide more context on the incident with the young man in room 312? Danielle swallowed, her heart racing. This was it, the first sign that her efforts were being taken seriously. She provided details, recounted her observations, and clarified the discrepancies she had documented. The agent's follow-up questions were pointed but respectful, confirming that the FBI was fully invested in understanding the scope of the misconduct. Simultaneously, subtle changes began to ripple through the hospital. Certain officers started noticing that Danielle was asking more pointed questions about their reports. They were cautious, wary, but unaware of the full extent of her involvement with federal authorities. Their reactions, however, only confirmed what Danielle already suspected. The system she was challenging was alert, vigilant, and self-protective. At home, Danielle continued compiling evidence. Her sense of urgency heightened. She knew that the FBI was piecing together her files to identify not only the immediate perpetrators, but also the systemic enablers who allowed abuse to flourish unchecked. Every photograph, every audio snippet, every altered form could be crucial in holding the guilty accountable. She also began to notice subtle acknowledgments from her colleagues, small, almost imperceptible nods, fleeting glances of understanding. Some of them were silent allies, aware of the pattern she had been documenting but unable to act themselves. Danielle realized that her work was becoming more than a solitary mission. It was a thread in a larger fabric of accountability, stretching across the hospital and beyond. Yet, she remained cautious. Any misstep could jeopardize not only her career, but the safety of the victims whose lives were intertwined with the evidence she had gathered. She moved carefully, balancing her daytime responsibilities with the clandestine work that now defined her nights. Despite the tension, a quiet satisfaction settled over her. The first lead had been established. The FBI was actively investigating, the system's cracks were becoming exposed, and Danielle Harris, nurse, observer, and now informant, was finally being heard. For the first time, the pattern of silence she had endured for so long was beginning to break, and Danielle knew, deep in her bones, that the battle had only just begun. Suspicion rises. By now, Danielle's careful balancing act was beginning to show subtle cracks. She moved through the hospital halls with the same composure she always had, but sharp eyes began noticing small changes in her routine. She lingered over charts longer than usual. She whispered into her encrypted recorder when alone. Her gaze lingered on reports with an intensity that was hard to miss. Colleagues who had once treated her as an unflappable anchor started exchanging furtive glances. "Have you noticed Danielle's been acting differently?" one nurse whispered to another near the supply closet. No one dared confront her directly. It was impossible to know what she knew, what she was documenting, or whether speaking out might endanger themselves. The subtle tension in the hospital grew like a low murmur. Officers assigned to the ER began pausing a little longer when Danielle asked questions, frowning at the specificity of her observations. Some nurses hesitated before entering patient rooms, aware that Danielle's scrutiny had intensified. It was as though the hospital itself had become a pressure cooker of observation, with Danielle at the center, quietly exposing patterns that others preferred to ignore. Danielle felt it too. Every glance from a colleague, every questioning eyebrow, every hushed conversation she overheard made her pulse quicken. Her careful measures to remain undetectable now had to be doubled. She adjusted her movements, altered her approach, and made even more meticulous notes of every interaction, every hint of suspicion. Yet she refused to let fear control her. The stakes were higher than her personal discomfort. They were about justice, accountability, and lives that depended on her courage. Every patient who came through the ER with injuries inconsistent with police reports was a silent plea for her diligence, a reminder that the work could not stop. Danielle also began noticing a more insidious form of observation. Paperwork on her desk subtly moved, phone calls intercepted, colleagues asking oddly pointed questions about her nights. Someone, somewhere, was starting to realize that she was more than just a nurse. Despite the creeping suspicion, Danielle stayed the course. She reminded herself that her work had purpose, that her evidence could not be ignored, and that the FBI now had her files. That knowledge provided her a sense of security, but also a sharpened edge. Any misstep could jeopardize everything she had risked. She learned to anticipate questions before they were asked, to document interactions in real time, and to move with a precision that kept her one step ahead of those who might challenge her. The hospital's quiet tension was palpable, but Danielle navigated it with a mix of caution and determination. In the silence between shifts, she reflected, suspicion might rise, but it could not stop truth. And Danielle Harris had dedicated herself to ensuring that truth would be heard, no matter how closely eyes followed her every move. The false accusation, The tension that had been building for weeks finally erupted one Thursday morning. Danielle arrived for her shift, coffee in hand, trying to shake off the unease that had been gnawing at her. But the familiar hum of the hospital seemed different today, charged, electric, as though the walls themselves were waiting. It started subtly. Officers who normally nodded politely now avoided eye contact. A supervisor lingered nearby, watching her interactions with a scrutinizing gaze. Then came the whisper, a rumor light at first, carried through the corridors like a faint but persistent echo. "She's been accessing confidential records," one officer murmured, barely above a whisper yet loud enough to be heard. "She shouldn't be looking at patient files that aren't assigned to her." Danielle froze, the words striking like a physical blow. Her stomach tightened, and she instinctively checked her pockets for her encrypted drives. The evidence she had carefully secured was safe. But the accusation had been planted, a deliberate attempt to discredit her, to intimidate her, to derail the mission she had worked so tirelessly to protect. By midday, the rumor had solidified into an official complaint. A police officer filed a written report. Nurse Danielle Harris suspected of accessing and copying confidential police records and patient files without authorization. The words burned on the page. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues, the officers, the hospital administrators, all silently judging, questioning, doubting. Danielle's first instinct was fear, but it was quickly replaced by clarity. She had anticipated resistance, subtle retaliation, even threats. But this was the first time the danger had taken a tangible, official form. Someone was trying to silence her, but they hadn't understood one critical fact. Danielle Harris was meticulous, organized, and careful. She immediately documented the accusation, taking photos of the complaint, noting the date, time, and reporting officer. She sent a secure update to her FBI contact, outlining the falsified claims and attaching evidence that proved her innocence. Every report she had gathered, every photo, every encrypted note, they would serve as shields against this attempt to intimidate her. Even as the hospital buzzed with whispered questions, Danielle remained calm, professional, and composed. She continued her rounds, attended to patients, and spoke gently to families hiding the storm that raged within. Each step, each action was deliberate, a reminder that integrity and vigilance could withstand even false accusations. That night, she sat alone in her apartment, reflecting on the escalation. The system she had challenged was fighting back, trying to discredit her work. But Danielle felt something else, resolve. The false accusation, rather than breaking her, sharpened her purpose. She realized the stakes were higher than ever. The FBI needed to see the truth. The victims needed her voice, and she could not allow fear or slander to stop her mission. Danielle Harris was no longer just a nurse or an observer. She was a guardian of accountability, and no fabricated complaint could silence her. The arrest. It was past midnight when Danielle finally stepped out of her apartment building, exhausted but determined. The day's shifts had been grueling, but she had stayed late to ensure that every report, every photograph, every note was perfectly organized and securely transmitted to her FBI contact. She felt the familiar weight of purpose pressing on her shoulders, a burden she had willingly embraced. As she reached the darkened parking lot, a sudden movement caught her eye. Flashing lights reflected off the glossy asphalt, and before she could react, a patrol car screeched to a halt in front of her. Two uniformed officers stepped out, their faces unreadable under the brim of their caps. "Step aside, ma'am," one said, his voice clipped, professional, yet carrying an undercurrent of accusation. Danielle's heart raced. She knew the drill. She had always been cautious, aware of how quickly a situation could escalate, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for the surreal moment that followed. Without warning, one officer grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back with practiced force. "You're under arrest," he said. "We have reason to believe you've accessed confidential files without authorization." Shock, disbelief, and a surge of fear collided inside her. I haven't done anything wrong," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. She tried to reach for her ID, for her work badge, for anything that could prove her innocence, but the handcuffs were already snapping into place, cold metal biting into her wrists. The officers guided her toward the patrol car, their grips firm and unyielding. Danielle's mind raced. Every step, every movement was documented in her memory, the flickering streetlights, the distant hum of the city, the quiet echo of her own heartbeat. Her body shook, but she forced herself to stay composed, to project calm even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. Passers-by stopped, some whispering, others staring, but Danielle barely registered them. Her thoughts were on the evidence she had gathered, the lives that depended on her, and the injustice of being treated like a criminal when she was, in fact, a witness to systemic abuse. The officers did not respond to her protests, her explanations, her pleas. She was loaded into the back of the patrol car, the doors closing with a definitive thud that reverberated in her chest. Danielle stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past, feeling a strange mixture of fear and determination. In that moment, she realized the true gravity of her mission. The system she was exposing was fighting back, aggressively, personally, and unjustly. Yet, even in the confines of the patrol car, Danielle's resolve solidified. She would not be silenced. She would not be broken. As the vehicle drove into the night, Danielle's mind was already planning her next steps. Evidence, allies, the FBI, everything she had worked for was still within reach. And in the darkness, she understood something profoundly clear. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the commitment to act in spite of it. Danielle Harris, handcuffed but unyielding, was about to confront the system head-on, and she would do so on her own terms. The interrogation room. The fluorescent lights in the interrogation room buzzed softly, casting a harsh glow over the sterile walls. Danielle Harris sat rigidly on the metal chair, her hands still cuffed, wrists stinging from the tight steel. Across the table, two officers leaned forward, their expressions a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "You know why you're here," one began, his tone sharp, accusing. "Accessing records you have no business touching, sharing confidential information, betraying the department." Danielle lifted her chin, meeting their eyes evenly. "I've done nothing wrong," she replied calmly, each word deliberate. "I've documented abuse. I've reported misconduct. That's my duty as a nurse and as a witness to the truth." The other officer sneered, slamming a fist on the table. "Duty? You call this duty? You're a traitor, Danielle. You're undermining your colleagues. You're turning your back on your own team." Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain composed. She had anticipated this. She had prepared for every accusation, every insult, every attempt to intimidate her. The room was small, the air heavy with tension, but Danielle's mind was clear, focused, unwavering. "You call it betrayal," she said, her voice steady. "I call it justice. If exposing wrongdoing makes me a traitor in your eyes, then so be it. I cannot remain silent while lives are harmed and the law is ignored." The officers exchanged a glance, the momentary hesitation betraying a flicker of uncertainty. One leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're risking your career. Do you even understand what you've done?" Danielle's eyes narrowed, the sting of anger mingling with resolve. "I understand perfectly. I've risked everything to ensure the truth is heard. My career, yes. But the truth? That is not something I will compromise, not for fear, not for intimidation, not for anyone." For a tense moment, silence fell over the room. The only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights and the occasional shuffle of papers. Danielle's heart pounded in her chest, yet she sat unyielding, radiating a calm that belied the storm around her. "You're going to regret this," one officer muttered finally, his voice low, almost a threat. Danielle met his gaze without flinching. "I don't regret standing for what is right," she said, "and one day when the truth comes to light, people will see who was courageous enough to act and who was too afraid to stand up." The officers leaned back, their fury contained but far from dissipated. Danielle had survived the first wave of intimidation, but she knew this was only the beginning. The system was powerful, entrenched, and resistant to change. Yet in that small, harshly lit room, she had demonstrated something more important than fear. She had demonstrated that integrity could not be silenced. Danielle Harris had been labeled a traitor, but in the quiet defiance of that interrogation room, she became something far more formidable, a beacon of accountability, unwavering and resolute, prepared to face whatever came next. Hours in detention. The metal bench was cold beneath her, unforgiving as the hours dragged on. Danielle Harris shifted uncomfortably, her wrists sore from the handcuffs, her mind a whirlwind of frustration, fear, and determination. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, casting long shadows across the blank, sterile walls of the holding cell. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each minute a reminder of the injustice she faced. She sat in silence, broken only by the distant footsteps of officers and the occasional clang of metal doors. The echo of those sounds reminded her how isolated she truly was, surrounded by authority, yet utterly powerless in that moment. Every passing second emphasized the absurdity of her situation. A nurse, a caregiver, someone committed to saving lives, treated as a criminal for simply doing her job. Danielle's thoughts wandered to the faces of the young patients she had tended that day, the bruises she had noticed but couldn't ignore, and the falsified reports that had led her to secretly contact the FBI. Her heart ached with the knowledge that she was being punished for standing up to systemic abuse, while those responsible for the very misconduct she exposed remained free. Memories of her upbringing flashed in her mind. Her mother, a nurse who had dedicated herself to the care of others, teaching Danielle the importance of compassion and courage. Her father, a strict military man, instilling discipline and resilience. Those lessons now felt like lifelines, reminding her that fear could be acknowledged but not allowed to dictate her actions. She focused on her breathing, deliberately slowing her pulse, grounding herself against the rising tide of anxiety. Danielle knew that panic would serve no purpose. The FBI had her files, the truth was documented, and this detention, as humiliating as it was only a temporary obstacle. She mentally rehearsed every detail, every fact, ensuring that when the time came to speak again, she would do so with clarity and authority. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. Danielle counted tiles on the floor, noted the flicker of the lights, and listened to the hum of the building, treating every sound as a marker of time. Despite the isolation, a quiet determination grew within her. She refused to let despair take root. Every moment in that cell was a reminder of why she had embarked on this dangerous path in the first place: to protect the vulnerable, to expose the truth, and to hold those in power accountable. As the night deepened, Danielle Harris remained seated, handcuffed yet unbroken, a figure of resilience in a place designed to suppress her spirit. The hours of detention tested her patience and resolve, but they could not touch her courage. Even in solitude and silence, she was preparing for the battle ahead, one that would demand every ounce of strength, intelligence, and determination she possessed. The discovery. Back at the precinct, the officers ran Danielle's information through the usual channels, expecting a routine background check, nothing out of the ordinary, just another nurse accused of minor infractions. They didn't anticipate the anomaly that would turn the room upside down. As the digital files scrolled across the computer screens, a senior agent paused, brow furrowed. The name Danielle Harris appeared again and again, not in hospital records, but in confidential FBI documents, reports detailing ongoing investigations, witness testimonies, and sensitive internal communications, all connected to her. "Wait a minute, what is this?" the agent muttered, leaning closer. He scrolled through the encrypted logs, eyes widening with each click. There she was, not a rogue nurse meddling in files, but a key informant, an anonymous source who had been providing crucial evidence in multiple cases of misconduct and abuse within the police force. The room grew silent, tension crackling in the air like static before a storm. Officers exchanged nervous glances, disbelief written plainly across their faces. The very woman they had arrested, humiliated and accused of betraying them, was, in fact, working alongside the FBI to expose systemic wrongdoing. The implications sank in slowly, but the impact was immediate. Their authority had been challenged, their assumptions shattered, and their error laid bare. "Are you seeing this?" one officer whispered, barely audible. Another nodded, eyes wide. She's been working with the FBI all along?" Confirmation came as more files were accessed, revealing a pattern of meticulous documentation, photos of altered reports, recordings of conversations, and detailed notes tracing the chain of misconduct. Danielle's careful, deliberate efforts were unmistakable. Every action she had taken was calculated, precise, and legal, designed to protect herself and the integrity of the evidence while exposing those who sought to cover up their abuse. A mixture of shock, fear, and indignation swept through the precinct. The officers who had arrested her suddenly recognized the enormity of their mistake, their arrogance, their assumptions, their dismissal of her reports, all now glaringly obvious. Danielle Harris was not merely a nurse. She was a guardian of truth, a pivotal figure in an investigation that threatened to expose entrenched corruption. Back in her cell, Danielle remained unaware of the discovery unfolding on the other side of the precinct walls. She focused inward, conserving her energy, preparing mentally for what she knew would be a critical turning point. The hours of waiting, The interrogations and the false accusations were approaching their climax, and yet, despite the mounting tension, she felt a quiet, resolute satisfaction. The truth she had so painstakingly collected was undeniable. The system had begun to recognize what she already knew. Danielle Harris was not to be underestimated. Her courage, intellect, and relentless pursuit of justice were about to redefine the very narrative that had sought to silence her. The discovery had been made, and with it, the balance of power began to shift. The silence that followed. For a moment, the precinct was enveloped in a rare and suffocating silence. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant buzz of radios, and the shuffle of papers all seemed to vanish, leaving only the weight of disbelief hanging heavily in the room. The officers stared at their screens, at the files that revealed the shocking truth. Danielle Harris was no ordinary nurse. She was an FBI informant, a key witness documenting police misconduct, a protector of the very law they swore to uphold. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The officer who had filed the false accusation felt a cold rush of dread crawling down his spine. Every action, every decision that had led to Danielle's arrest now appeared in stark, humiliating relief. He replayed the night in his mind. The abrupt handcuffing, the harsh words, the dismissive shoves, all directed at someone whose work had been legal, vital, and courageous. Around the room, murmurs began, tentative at first, then growing in volume and intensity. We arrested her," one officer whispered, voice trembling. "We handcuffed an FBI informant?" Another shook his head, his jaw tight. "This can't be happening. This isn't real." Every glance exchanged in that room was a mixture of fear and shame. The false accusation, the interrogations, the hours Danielle had spent detained, all were now framed in a new, devastating light. The officers recognized the catastrophic error, a systemic failure compounded by arrogance and assumptions. They had underestimated her, dismissed her diligence, and nearly destroyed her credibility and safety in the process. One senior agent finally broke the silence, his voice low and tight. "We need to fix this, fast, contain the situation, make sure she's okay, and make sure this doesn't go further." But even as he spoke, the enormity of the mistake could not be erased. Danielle Harris's courage and foresight had turned the tables, and there was no simple way to undo the impact. For a few long, heavy minutes, the officers sat frozen, confronting the reality of their error. Pride and protocol clashed with the undeniable facts before them. Every defensive posture they had assumed moments earlier now felt ridiculous, meaningless. The realization settled like a stone in their stomachs. They had misjudged her completely, misread her intentions, and ignored the truth she had been presenting all along. Meanwhile, Danielle remained in the holding cell, unaware of the quiet storm her discovery had unleashed. Yet, even in ignorance of their panic, her presence, her meticulous actions, and her unwavering integrity had already begun to shift the balance. The very system that sought to intimidate her was now scrambling, reacting to the realization that the woman they had tried to suppress was more powerful than they had ever imagined. In the stillness, one thing was certain. The silence that followed was not just shock, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Danielle Harris had exposed the fragility of arrogance, the cost of underestimating courage, and the undeniable force of truth standing firm in the face of injustice. Damage control. The precinct erupted into organized chaos. Phones rang incessantly, radios crackled with urgent messages, and officers hurried from desk to desk, each one carrying a growing sense of panic. The discovery that Danielle Harris was an FBI informant had ignited a storm, and everyone instinctively understood that containment was the only option. "Patch this through to internal affairs. Now!" barked the senior agent, his voice sharp, eyes scanning the room like a hawk. "We need statements, explanations, anything to keep this under wraps." Others were on phones reaching out to superiors, attempting to spin the narrative, framing Danielle as a rogue employee, a misstep in procedure, anything to divert scrutiny from the department's negligence. It was a frenzy of half-truths and misdirection, each attempt more desperate than the last. Meanwhile, officers who had personally handled Danielle's arrest were forced to issue a series of reluctant apologies. We misjudged the situation," one officer muttered, avoiding her gaze. Another fumbled with his words, voice tight with unease. "We acted on misinformation. We never intended to harm you, Ms. Harris." Danielle, seated calmly in the holding cell, listened through the faint echo of voices outside. She recognized the sound of panic, the rattling of those who had underestimated her and now scrambled to cover their mistakes. Her mind remained focused, unshaken. She knew the attempts to apologize and contain the situation were performative, reactive, and ultimately powerless to erase the truth she had documented so meticulously. Despite the flurry of activity, the officers struggled to reconcile their professional duties with the humiliation of being exposed. Every conversation, every hurried meeting carried an undercurrent of fear of public backlash, of federal inquiry, and of the undeniable evidence Danielle had amassed. The very system they sought to protect was now unraveling under the weight of her courage. One officer finally stormed toward the holding cell, clutching a hastily written statement. "Ms. Harris, we apologize for the misunderstanding," he stammered. "It was never our intention." Danielle regarded him with a measured calm, her eyes steady, voice controlled. "Intention does not erase the consequences," she said. "Every second you ignored reports, every dismissal of evidence, every false accusation, those are the facts. Apologies are meaningless without accountability and systemic change." The room fell silent, the gravity of her words sinking in. Outside, the precinct continued its scramble, but the pattern was clear. This was no longer a simple matter to be swept under the rug. Danielle Harris had turned the tide. Her meticulous evidence, her unshakable integrity, and her courage in the face of intimidation had created a situation that could not be hidden, spun, or silenced. In the midst of the chaos, one undeniable truth emerged. Damage control could be attempted, apologies could be offered, but the power of truth, when wielded by someone courageous and prepared, could not be contained. Danielle Harris had exposed the system, and there was no going back. The calm fury. Danielle Harris stood in the conference room, her posture poised, every inch the professional she had always been. The officers and administrators who had orchestrated her arrest hovered uneasily, shifting in their seats, unsure of how to address the storm they had unleashed. Apologies had been delivered, statements read aloud, yet none of it had touched the core of the injustice. Danielle wasn't here for empty words. She was here for accountability. "I am not here to accept excuses," she began, her voice calm but charged with authority. "I am not here to forgive negligence that endangered my life, my credibility, and my integrity. Every action taken against me was based on assumptions, ignorance, and bias, and every one of you knows it." A heavy silence fell over the room. The officers avoided eye contact, their hands nervously fidgeting. Danielle's calm fury was disarming. It was impossible to challenge, impossible to dismiss. She continued, enumerating the details of her arrest, the hours of detention, the interrogations, and the attempts to discredit her work. Each word was precise, measured, yet carried the weight of indignation that refused to be subdued. "You handcuffed me, questioned me, and treated me as a criminal, all while ignoring the evidence I had been providing for months. And now, after the fact, you hope that apologies and damage control will erase the consequences. It will not." Her eyes swept across the room, making contact with every face, ensuring that her presence and her dignity could not be overlooked. Danielle's calm fury wasn't just anger. It was a deliberate, controlled force, rooted in righteousness and strategy. She had anticipated this confrontation. She had prepared, documented, and rehearsed the points that would leave no room for denial. Every claim she made was backed by evidence, every accusation supported by records and reports meticulously gathered over time. "I demand that this department take responsibility publicly," she said firmly. "Not a vague memo, not a silent internal reprimand. The public has a right to know that mistakes of this magnitude cannot go unchecked. This is not about me. It's about the system, the trust the community places in you, and the duty you swore to uphold." The room remained silent, save for the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Danielle's calm fury had transformed the atmosphere. What had begun as intimidation and chaos was now tempered by her unwavering command of truth. She had shifted the power dynamic without raising her voice, without threats or aggression, simply by standing firm in her dignity and in the evidence she carried. As she concluded, the officers recognized a truth they could not evade. Danielle Harris would not be silenced, manipulated, or pacified. Her demand for accountability was just, unyielding, and inevitable. The calm fury in her presence was a force of justice itself, quiet yet unstoppable, precise yet overwhelming. Danielle had made her stance clear. Integrity would not be compromised, and no apology, however forced, would suffice without real, tangible change. The media storm. By morning, the story had escaped the confines of the precinct and exploded into the public sphere. The arrest of Danielle Harris, the nurse who had bravely exposed systemic abuse, had become a headline across local and national news outlets. Screens flickered in homes, offices, and cafes, each broadcast replaying images of her handcuffed in the holding cell, juxtaposed with photos of her in her professional uniform, tending to patients with care and compassion. Police arrest FBI informant. Courage or controversy, blared one headline. Another read, whistleblower detained, how one nurse exposed abuse and faced the system. Social media erupted with opinions, some praising her bravery, others questioning her methods, but no one could ignore the spectacle. Hashtags trended, hashtags that quickly became rallying points for public discussion. Justice for Danielle, Beck's nurse whistleblower, police accountability. News anchors dissected the events in real time, speculating on the failures within the department and debating the implications for law enforcement oversight. Interviews with legal experts, civil rights advocates, and community leaders filled the airwaves, all reflecting on the gravity of the situation. Danielle's name, once known only within hospital corridors and FBI circles, was now being spoken in households, classrooms, and workplaces across the nation. Meanwhile, the public's reaction was polarized but passionate. Some viewers condemned the department's handling of the case, highlighting the systemic issues of bias and negligence that Danielle had long sought to expose. Others, influenced by years of institutional loyalty or skepticism toward whistleblowers, questioned her intentions, wondering whether her actions had jeopardized investigations or professional protocols. Editorial columns appeared overnight, dissecting not only the facts of her arrest, but the broader narrative, the courage of an individual standing against entrenched systems of power, the risks faced by whistleblowers, and the implications for future cases. Community forums buzzed with discussion, people sharing their own experiences with systemic injustice and offering support for Danielle's cause. In hospitals and healthcare networks, colleagues and fellow nurses expressed solidarity, recounting similar experiences of ignored complaints, pressure to remain silent, and fear of retaliation. Her bravery became a symbol for those who had suffered in silence, a reminder that standing up to wrongdoing, no matter how daunting, could ignite change. Even within the precinct, officers and administrators felt the ripple effect of the media storm. Public scrutiny intensified, internal discussions grew more urgent, and the pressure to address the mistakes of the previous night became unavoidable. Danielle's actions had transformed a personal ordeal into a national conversation, forcing accountability and shining a harsh light on previously hidden misconduct. Amid the frenzy of cameras, commentary, and online discourse, one thing remained undeniable. Danielle Harris had become the catalyst for a storm that could no longer be contained. Her courage, integrity, and unwavering pursuit of justice were now a story that demanded attention, reflection, and action. Political reverberations. By midweek, Danielle Harris's case had transcended headlines and social media debates. Lawmakers in the state Senate convened to address the public outcry, compelled by the undeniable evidence of systemic failure and the courage of one nurse who had risked everything to expose it. The chamber buzzed with tension, reporters filling the galleries, cameras flashing, and constituents demanding accountability. Senators from both parties took the floor, each attempting to navigate the delicate balance between defending law enforcement and acknowledging undeniable misconduct. "We cannot ignore the documented abuses that have now come to light," one senator declared, holding a stack of reports tied directly to Danielle's whistleblowing. "This is not about undermining the police. This is about protecting the rights and dignity of every citizen and ensuring our hospitals and law enforcement agencies uphold the highest standards." Opposition voices raised concerns about procedure, emphasizing the complexity of internal investigations and the potential risks posed by unauthorized disclosures. Yet, even the most resistant voices could not dismiss the weight of the evidence Danielle had gathered. Her meticulous records, corroborated by the FBI, painted an irrefutable picture of negligence, intimidation, and systemic bias that demanded reform. Discussions quickly expanded beyond Danielle's personal ordeal, evolving into broader debates about police accountability, hospital transparency, and the mechanisms that allow misconduct to persist unchecked. Proposals were introduced to enforce stricter oversight on law enforcement practices, mandatory reporting of internal violations within healthcare institutions, and protections for whistleblowers who courageously step forward. As the debates continued, Danielle's name was invoked repeatedly, not merely as the nurse who had been wrongfully detained, but as a symbol of integrity and resilience. Lawmakers recognized that her bravery had illuminated weaknesses in the system that could no longer be ignored. Her actions had catalyzed a dialogue that transcended partisanship, uniting voices committed to meaningful, enforceable change. Outside the Senate chamber, journalists and advocacy groups amplified the developments, explaining complex proposals in accessible language and encouraging citizens to engage. Social media campaigns urged followers to demand legislative action, while public forums hosted discussions on accountability, ethics, and the courage required to confront institutional abuse. Through it all, Danielle Harris remained steadfast, observing from a distance but fully aware of the influence her actions were creating. She understood that true change required more than individual bravery. It required the collective force of public pressure, political will, and legal safeguards. By the end of the week, preliminary reforms were being drafted, committees established, and investigations launched to prevent future injustices. Danielle's ordeal, once a personal battle against intimidation and false accusations, had become a catalyst for systemic change. Her courage had not only exposed wrongdoing, it had sparked a movement demanding accountability, transparency, and protection for those who dared to speak the truth. In the echo of legislative chambers and public debate, one thing was certain: Danielle Harris had turned a personal struggle into a catalyst for justice that would resonate far beyond her immediate circumstances. Family impact. The evening was quiet at Danielle Harris's home, a stark contrast to the media storm and political whirlwind she had faced all day. The front door closed behind her with a gentle click, yet the tension from the past 48 hours still clung to her, heavy as a winter coat. Her mother, a retired nurse who had always inspired Danielle's own dedication to care, waited in the living room, her eyes reflecting equal parts concern and pride. "Mom," Danielle began, her voice measured, yet tinged with exhaustion, "I never wanted to put anyone through this, especially you and Jason, but I couldn't stay silent, I had to act." Her mother reached out, taking her hand. "Danielle, I've watched you grow into someone remarkable. Courage isn't about the absence of fear, it's about what you do in spite of it. You've shown more bravery than most people will ever know." Danielle sank into the couch, the tension easing slightly as she absorbed her mother's words. But the weight of the day's events pressed on her shoulders. "It's not just me," she admitted softly. "It's about all the people who can't speak up. Every report I made, every risk I took, it was for them too. And I want Jason to understand that, to know why it matters to stand for what's right, even when it's terrifying." Her teenage son, Jason, who had been quietly listening from the corner of the room, finally spoke. "Mom, I was scared. When they took you, I didn't know if they'd let you come back. But I get it now. I see why you did it. You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for everyone who couldn't." His voice wavered, but there was a newfound determination in his eyes. Danielle nodded, swallowing a lump in her throat. "Exactly, Jason. Courage isn't a one-time act. It's every decision we make to uphold justice, even when the system seems stacked against us. You will face situations in your life where standing up won't be easy, but you have to do it anyway because the alternative is complicity." Her mother squeezed her hand again. "You've given him a lesson he'll carry forever, not just about courage, but about integrity and humanity. That's more than any award or recognition can ever measure." The three of them sat together in reflective silence, letting the words sink in. Outside, the city lights flickered, a reminder that the world beyond their walls was watching, judging, and learning from Danielle's actions. Within the small circle of family, however, there was a sense of peace, an understanding that, despite the fear, the humiliation, and the struggle, their bond and shared values had only grown stronger. In that quiet living room, Danielle realized that the personal cost of her fight for justice had also become its most profound reward, teaching her son the meaning of courage, inspiring her mother's pride, and reinforcing that standing for truth, even when it's dangerous, was a legacy worth leaving. The family's hearts were heavy with emotion, yet filled with an unwavering resolve. Justice, integrity, and courage were worth every sacrifice. New purpose. Danielle Harris sat at her desk, Surrounded by stacks of notes, policy documents, and training manuals she had painstakingly prepared. The events of the past weeks, the arrest, the media frenzy, the political debates, had left scars, but they had also crystallized a new mission. She would not allow her experience to fade into mere headlines or cautionary tales. Instead, she would transform it into action, creating a foundation to empower healthcare professionals to speak up against abuse and systemic negligence. The idea had taken root the moment she realized that fear and institutional silence were the true enemies. Nurses, doctors, and hospital staff often witnessed misconduct or coercion, yet many remained silent, fearing retaliation or disbelief. Danielle understood this too well. She had lived it. Her arrest and humiliation had shown that even the most courageous could be targeted, but they could also change the system from within. Her foundation, she decided, would focus on 3 pillars: education, protection, and advocacy. Workshops would train medical staff to identify red flags in patient care, recognize patterns of abuse, and report incidents safely and effectively. Legal consultations would be made available, providing guidance on navigating institutional bureaucracy and protecting whistleblowers. Advocacy initiatives would connect healthcare workers to policymakers, amplifying their voices and pushing for legislative safeguards. Danielle's phone buzzed with messages from nurses across the country, some expressing fear, others gratitude, but all inspired by her courage. She felt the weight of responsibility, but also the exhilaration of tangible change. Every conversation reminded her that this mission was bigger than herself. It was about reshaping the culture of healthcare, one professional at a time. The Foundation's launch event was modest, but powerful. Danielle spoke directly to an audience of medical staff, law students, and community leaders. She shared her story, not to dwell on her personal ordeal, but to highlight the importance of vigilance, integrity, and courage. Her words were precise, heartfelt, and resonant, emphasizing that systemic change requires both individual action and collective effort. Media outlets covered the event, framing Danielle not as a victim, but as a trailblazer. Her calm determination, coupled with her meticulous approach to reform, inspired professionals across disciplines to engage, volunteer, and advocate. Emails flooded in, invitations to speak at conferences, webinars, and legislative forums. Her experience had become a blueprint for empowering others, a roadmap for transforming fear into proactive accountability. Even late at night, as she reviewed training materials and strategized outreach programs, Danielle felt a renewed sense of purpose. The humiliation, the arrest, the political battles, they were no longer scars, but catalysts. Her journey had evolved from personal survival into a movement for justice, protection, and education. Through her foundation, Danielle Harris ensured that the courage she had exhibited would multiply, touching lives, safeguarding patients, and shaping a future where speaking the truth was not just respected, it was expected. Her mission was clear: to turn trauma into transformation, fear into empowerment, and silence into action. Reflective Danielle Harris sat quietly in her office, the soft hum of fluorescent lights above reflecting the calm after weeks of turbulence. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm, oblivious to the storm she had faced and the change she had ignited. But inside, Danielle's mind wandered through the arc of her journey, from the late-night arrest to the public scrutiny, to the political debates, and finally, to the foundation she now led. Each moment had been a test of courage, integrity, and resilience. She reflected on the universal truths embedded in her experience. Truth has a power that cannot be contained, even when systems are built to suppress it. Courage is not measured by the absence of fear, but by the resolve to act despite it. Humanity is defined by the choices we make to protect one another, to stand against injustice, and to uphold dignity in the face of intimidation. Danielle had learned these lessons in the most extreme way, and now, through her actions, she had the opportunity to pass them on to others. Her story was more than a personal battle. It was a mirror for society, reflecting the failures of systems designed to protect, but too often silent in the face of abuse. The narrative extended far beyond one hospital, one department, one arrest. It was a call to action for individuals everywhere to listen, observe, and act when wrongdoing occurs, regardless of personal risk. Danielle had transformed fear into empowerment, isolation into community, and adversity into systemic reform. She thought of the countless nurses and healthcare workers who had witnessed injustice and felt powerless. Her foundation, her lectures and her advocacy had become a lifeline, a way to ensure that no one would remain silent, and that courage would be met not with punishment, but with support. Danielle's journey demonstrated that one voice, meticulously documented and unwaveringly principled, could ripple outward to create monumental change. As the evening light filtered through the office windows, Danielle smiled at the knowledge that the system could no longer operate unchecked. She had been underestimated, silenced, and humiliated, but in doing so, she had exposed the weaknesses of a system that needed reform. Her voice, amplified by action and truth, had become a beacon for others. And so, as this story draws to a close, remember this: the power of truth is unstoppable, courage is contagious, and humanity is measured by our willingness to stand for what is right. They thought they were silencing a nurse, but they exposed the system she was meant to heal. If Danielle's story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect, don't let it stop here. Like this video to support stories of courage, share it so others can witness the impact of standing up against injustice, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. It's incredible how far a single story can travel, and together we can make sure its message reaches every corner.